Truth is not something we invent. It is something we uncover, often painfully, by stripping away illusions and confronting the reality that lies beneath. Nations, like individuals, are confronted with choices, to either bow to the pressures of power or to stand in the dignity of truth. When India spoke, it was not merely diplomacy. It was a manifestation of clarity, forged in the crucible of centuries of resilience. What unsettled the West was not aggression, but an unshakable recognition of what is real. You see, power without truth is fragile, like a giant built on sand, impressive for a moment, but doomed to collapse. Truth, on the other hand, even when expressed softly, carries weight that cannot be dismissed. This is why the words of a smaller or less powerful nation can still reverberate globally. It is not the size of the army, nor the wealth of the treasury, that guarantees influence. It is the alignment with reality that compels respect. And once spoken, truth echoes far beyond the borders of the one who dared utter it. What makes truth so dangerous to entrenched power is its capacity to reveal hypocrisy. When a nation stands before giants and articulates a reality that those giants would rather ignore, it forces a confrontation. The confrontation is not violent, yet it shakes the foundations of authority because it reminds everyone that power is not absolute. If the West is shocked, it is because it saw a mirror held up to its face, a mirror that revealed contradictions it prefers to keep hidden. Truth has this unsettling quality. It disrupts the comfortable narratives that sustain empires, and when disruption comes, those who depended on the illusion feel a sudden vulnerability. This is not a geopolitical accident, it is a psychological law. To deny truth is to build a life or a system on lies. Lies demand maintenance, endless energy, and ceaseless suppression. But truth requires nothing. It simply exists, immovable, waiting to be acknowledged. History provides countless examples of the triumph of truth over might. Consider the prophets of the Old Testament standing against kings and empires, armed with nothing but words. They were ridiculed, threatened, and ignored, yet their voices endured, while the kingdoms they opposed crumbled into dust. Or take figures like Gandhi, whose refusal to submit to imperial force was not a rejection of law, but a demand for a higher law rooted in reality. His truth shook the British Empire more deeply than armies could. India's statement in our time belongs to this lineage. It is not the act of aggression, but the act of illumination. When a nation refuses to flatter power, it forces the world to re-examine what it assumed to be unshakable. This is why such replies feel chilling, because they pull away the curtain behind which power hides. Truth, once revealed, cannot be unseen, and that is what terrifies the mighty. At an individual level, the same principle applies. Each of us knows, in the silence of our conscience, the truths we avoid. We construct excuses, bend the facts, and weave stories to protect ourselves from discomfort. But the price of these falsehoods is immense. The longer we evade reality, the more fragile we become. Eventually, a word of truth, spoken by someone else or whispered from within, shatters the careful construction. It feels like betrayal, but it is liberation. This is what happened on the global stage when India spoke. Its words carried the authority of truth, and that authority disrupted the balance of power, not by force, but by exposure. You must understand that power resists exposure, because exposure reveals its limitations. What is built on lies cannot withstand light, and what is aligned with truth does not fear it. The West, shocked by such clarity, is experiencing what any of us feel when our self-deceptions are unveiled. It is painful, disorienting, even humiliating. Yet, paradoxically, it is also necessary. Without truth, there is no correction, no growth, no possibility of stability. A system that cannot tolerate truth cannot endure for long. That is why empires fall, why tyrannies collapse, why individuals consumed by deceit ultimately break. When India spoke, it reminded the world of this eternal law. Words rooted in reality pierce through the noise of propaganda, the fog of manipulation, the intimidation of size and wealth. It is precisely this piercing quality that unsettles those accustomed to dominance. They are not used to being spoken to in such terms. They expect compliance, deference, or silence, not courage articulated with calm precision. And there is something profoundly admirable about that calmness. Truth does not require shouting. It does not need theatrics or bluster. It stands on its own, serene and immovable. When India delivered its reply, it did so without hysteria, without exaggeration, without the need to inflate its position. That restraint is precisely what made it so powerful. A calm truth is like a clear bell ringing in a noisy room, impossible to ignore, even if one tries to cover one's ears. The noise of politics, the constant barrage of statements and counter-statements, often clouds perception. But when truth emerges, it cuts through the chaos with surgical precision. That clarity unsettles because it leaves no room for ambiguity. And once you hear it, you cannot pretend you didn't. That is the terrifying strength of truth. It demands recognition. If we think deeply about it, truth is the great equalizer. A small nation can confront a superpower. A single individual can face an institution. A child can expose the dishonesty of an adult. Power does not grant immunity from reality, though it often deludes people into thinking it does. What India revealed through its words is that sovereignty is not simply a matter of territory, but of principle. The principle is simple: to speak truth even when it is inconvenient, even when it is dangerous. That principle endows even the seemingly powerless with extraordinary strength. And that strength cannot be purchased, coerced, or stolen. It belongs only to those who have the courage to align with reality. In that sense, India reminded the world of something it had forgotten, that truth is stronger than intimidation. The reason this unsettles the West so profoundly is because it forces a reckoning with its own contradictions. Nations that preach freedom and justice must face the fact that they often act against those very ideals. A mirror has been held up and the reflection is not flattering. This is why truth is often hated, because it exposes. Exposure is painful. It reveals hypocrisy, undermines authority, and threatens to unravel carefully constructed narratives. Yet exposure is also the first step toward redemption. Without it, corruption deepens and self-destruction becomes inevitable. India's words functioned as that mirror, not only for the West, but for the global order. And once spoken, such words spread. They awaken others, they plant seeds, and seeds of truth once sown grow in the most unexpected places. So the chilling quality of India's reply does not lie in aggression or hostility, but in its unwavering alignment with what is real. It is the clarity that shocks, not the volume. It is the precision that unsettles, not the anger. Truth spoken with conviction reminds us all of the ultimate law. Reality cannot be bent indefinitely to suit power. Eventually, reality asserts itself, often through the voice of the courageous, and when it does, it cuts through power like light cuts through darkness. That is what we witnessed. And that is why the world, no matter how powerful, was forced to pause, to listen, and to feel the weight of something greater than might, the weight of truth itself. Sovereignty is often mistaken for freedom in its most superficial sense, the absence of restraint, the ability to do whatever one pleases. But that is not sovereignty, that is chaos disguised as liberty. Real sovereignty, whether for an individual or a nation, is responsibility accepted voluntarily. It is the recognition that independence is not merely a privilege but a burden. When India replied firmly on the world stage, it was not arrogance masquerading as strength. It was an acknowledgement that to be sovereign is to carry the duty of truth, even when truth is unwelcome. This is why such words resonate far beyond borders, because they remind us of a fundamental principle. Freedom without responsibility is ruin. To stand as a sovereign nation means to stand accountable for what you believe in. And accountability is the foundation of authentic strength. Think about what happens in our personal lives when we confuse freedom with indulgence. A young person may say, "I am free, I can do whatever I want," and then sink into habits that erode them over time. That isn't freedom. That's enslavement to impulse. Similarly, a nation that bows to pressure for temporary peace or temporary favor is not sovereign. It is enslaved to convenience. Sovereignty is tested not when things are easy, but when choices are difficult. India's statement revealed precisely that understanding. It showed the world that responsibility must override fear. And responsibility means acting with integrity, even when the cost is high. The West was unsettled because it expected compliance, yet was met with accountability instead. And accountability, in the face of intimidation, is something profoundly difficult to ignore. Responsibility is always heavier than indulgence, but it is the only path that leads upward. Every civilization that has endured understood this principle. Rome endured not because it was indulgent, but because it demanded responsibility from its citizens, until, of course, decadence eroded that responsibility. Nations rise when they carry responsibility, and they fall when they trade it for comfort or expedience. The same is true of the individual. When you assume responsibility, you become formidable, not because life is easy, but because you are fortified against its storms. This is the deeper meaning of sovereignty. When India stood and replied without bowing, it did so as a nation fortified by responsibility. It revealed to the world that sovereignty without responsibility is hollow, and that hollowness, once exposed, shocks those who have depended on it. You must understand that responsibility is not a privilege for the strong, but a necessity for survival. Without responsibility, strength dissipates into nothing. The individual who shirks responsibility becomes weak, resentful, and dependent. The nation that avoids responsibility becomes fragile, hypocritical, and easily manipulated. India's words demonstrated that sovereignty is not entitlement. It is earned daily through choices that affirm dignity. That is why the statement resonated as chilling, because it bore the weight of responsibility in a world accustomed to evasions. Responsibility clarifies. It strips away the unnecessary, it forces honesty, it demands consistency. And this is precisely what unsettled the global stage, an encounter with a nation that chose to shoulder its sovereignty rather than outsource it. That choice cannot be faked, and that is why it had such impact. When you shoulder responsibility, you discover that strength is not the absence of difficulty, but the capacity to endure it. A sovereign nation is not one that avoids conflict at any cost, but one that accepts the burden of principle even at great cost. This is the profound lesson India illustrated. Its words were not meant to provoke but to remind. Sovereignty means we carry our own load, even when others try to shift it onto us. This is why responsibility is inseparable from dignity. A nation without responsibility is like a person without purpose, unmoored, drifting, and subject to manipulation. The West's shock was not that India spoke loudly, but that it spoke responsibly, in a way that could not be dismissed as recklessness. That kind of responsibility cuts deeper than force. It exposes the moral weakness of those who demand obedience without earning respect. There is also a profound psychological truth here. When you take responsibility, you discover meaning. Meaning arises not from comfort or ease, but from carrying the heaviest burden you can reasonably bear. That is what gives life depth, what prevents despair, what allows individuals to stand upright in chaos. A nation that embraces responsibility discovers the same. India's willingness to assert sovereignty was simultaneously a willingness to embrace meaning in the global order. That meaning was expressed not in domination, but in steadfastness. And steadfastness in the face of pressure is what unsettles those who wield power casually, because responsibility reveals the limits of power that is unmoored from principle. It reminds the world that meaning is more enduring than fear, and fear, when confronted by meaning, begins to wither away. Responsibility is not glamorous. It doesn't attract applause in the moment. In fact, it often invites resistance, mockery, or hostility. Yet it is the only thing that builds lasting respect. Think of the parent who disciplines with fairness rather than indulgence. At first, the child resists, complains, perhaps even hates. But over time, that discipline builds trust and admiration. Nations function in the same way. When India assumed responsibility instead of appeasement, it risked criticism. Yet, in the long arc of history, such responsibility builds respect that cannot be commanded through fear alone. And respect, once earned, is the true currency of sovereignty. That is why words grounded in responsibility echo longer than threats. Threats fade when power shifts, but responsibility endures because it aligns with what is real. There is also danger in avoiding responsibility, and this danger cannot be overstated. The person who avoids responsibility becomes bitter, resentful, and destructive. The nation that avoids responsibility becomes unstable, hypocritical, and eventually collapses. You cannot build enduring systems on avoidance. You cannot construct dignity on excuses. So, when India spoke, it illuminated not only its own sovereignty, but also the dangers of shirking responsibility. It held up a contrast between what is earned and what is pretended. And pretension, when exposed, feels humiliating to those invested in it. That is why the West was unsettled. It was not simply confronted with defiance, but with an example of responsibility carried openly. Responsibility, once visible, exposes irresponsibility wherever it hides. That is its nature, and that is its power. So sovereignty, in its truest form, is not independence from the world, but dependence on principle. It is not the right to do anything, but the obligation to do what is necessary. It is a discipline, not a license. India's reply embodied this discipline, not by shouting louder but by standing firmer. That is why the statement carried weight. It was not mere rhetoric, but a demonstration of responsibility in action. And responsibility, when articulated clearly, reshapes the balance of power without needing to fire a shot. This is why nations tremble when confronted with it, because responsibility reveals who is grounded in reality and who is floating in illusion. And when illusion meets reality, illusion always shatters. That is what sovereignty demands. That is what responsibility requires. It is tempting, almost irresistibly so, to seek comfort in belonging. We crave acceptance, we crave agreement, we crave the reassurance that comes from knowing we are not alone. And yet, every significant act of transformation in history has come from those willing to stand apart. A nation, like an individual, reveals its strength not in moments of collective applause, but in moments of isolation. India's words unsettled the West, precisely because they were spoken without the shelter of allies, echoing the same sentiment. That is the essence of courage, to speak not because you know others will agree, but because you know it must be said. Standing alone is frightening because it strips you of camouflage, but it is also liberating because it reveals the truth of what you actually believe. The reason courage is so rare is because standing alone means bearing the full weight of consequence. When you act with a group, the responsibility is dispersed. The blame is diluted, and the risk is shared. But when you act alone, you carry the full burden on your shoulders. That is why courage is the highest of virtues, because it demands sacrifice without guarantee of recognition. Nations are no different. India, in that moment, bore the burden of standing without the protection of consensus, and that is why its words resonated so deeply, why they carried a weight far greater than their volume. The West did not expect defiance spoken so calmly and so singularly. But courage, by definition, is not predictable. It arises when all other options demand compromise, and yet you refuse to yield. You must remember that the archetype of the hero is always the individual who confronts chaos alone. Myths across cultures tell this same story: the warrior who leaves the village to face the dragon, the prophet who speaks against kings, the reformer who stands against the institution. These figures embody something eternal. That truth requires courage, and courage often means solitude. India's stance tapped into this archetypal narrative. It was not merely political maneuvering, but something deeper, something symbolic. It represented the eternal confrontation between principle and pressure, between conviction and compliance. And it reminded the world that all true acts of sovereignty are also acts of loneliness, because to stand apart is to risk everything for the sake of something greater. Psychologically, standing alone is terrifying because it activates our primal fear of rejection. Humans are tribal, we survive in groups. Exile once meant death, and so the instinct to conform runs deep in our blood. But progress depends on those willing to override that instinct, to risk rejection in order to reveal a higher truth. That is what courage looks like, whether in an individual life or in the life of a nation. India's reply carried that primal risk. It could have isolated itself, drawn criticism, or provoked retaliation. And yet it stood firm. That act resonates universally because each of us knows the fear of standing alone. We know it in our bones, and we know equally that our most defining moments come when we resist that fear and step forward anyway. The paradox is that standing alone, while frightening, is also the only path to genuine respect. People respect those who will not bend unjustly, even if they disagree with them. They may resent them in the moment, they may oppose them, but deep down, they recognize the courage it takes to stand firm. That is why India's statement shocked the West, not only because of what was said, but because of the audacity of saying it in solitude. Respect, after all, is not granted to those who grovel. It is granted to those who risk loss in defense of principle. And so too in your life. If you wish to be respected, you must be willing to stand for what is right, even when it costs you approval. Approval is cheap, respect is priceless, and respect is only earned through courage. Courage is not recklessness, though the two are often confused. Recklessness is action without thought, a plunge into danger without understanding the risk. Courage is something else entirely. It is the deliberate confrontation of fear, with eyes wide open, knowing full well what the cost might be. India's words were not reckless, they were measured, intentional, and yet unyielding. That balance is what made them powerful. The West recognized this difference instinctively. Recklessness can be dismissed. It burns out quickly. But courage that is grounded in principle and delivered with clarity cannot be ignored. It lingers, it unsettles, it forces reconsideration. And that lingering effect is why courage reshapes the narrative of history. Every individual faces their own version of this confrontation. You may not stand before nations, but you will stand before bosses, families, communities, where the pressure to conform is overwhelming. And you will know in your gut when what is being demanded of you is wrong. At that moment, you will face the same choice India faced: bend for safety or stand for principle. The world around you will tell you to bend, because bending is easier and safer in the short term, but your conscience will demand otherwise. If you stand, you will feel the weight of isolation, the sting of criticism, perhaps even the pain of loss. But you will also gain something immeasurable, the integrity of knowing you did not betray yourself. And that integrity is the foundation of real strength. It is worth noting that those who stand alone often inspire others to follow. Courage is contagious, though it begins in solitude. When one person dares to speak, others find their voices. When one nation dares to act, others find the strength to resist. India's stand was not just about itself, it set an example. And examples spread faster than commands. The West was shocked because it realized that if one nation could stand against pressure, others might follow. That is the true power of courage. It multiplies. It breaks the illusion that compliance is inevitable. And once that illusion shatters, the world shifts. This is how courage, beginning in solitude, transforms into collective change. Courage to stand alone also transforms the one who acts. Isolation burns away pretense. It forces clarity. It reveals to you who you actually are. When you are no longer shielded by the crowd, you see yourself with brutal honesty. That is both painful and necessary. India's act was not only a message to the world, but a declaration to itself. We are willing to bear this responsibility alone. That kind of declaration changes identity. It strengthens resolve. It draws a boundary between what you will tolerate and what you will never accept. And once that boundary is drawn, it becomes the cornerstone of character. Whether for a person or a nation, that cornerstone is what sustains you through the storms ahead. This is why courage, though rare, is so vital. It is the foundation upon which every other virtue stands. Without courage, truth is silenced, responsibility is avoided, and sovereignty collapses. Without courage, integrity is compromised, and respect is lost. India's reply embodied this timeless truth, that the strength of a nation, like the strength of a person, is measured not in comfort but in the willingness to stand alone. And the world, even when shocked, even when unsettled, cannot help but recognize it. Because deep down, we all know it. The future belongs not to those who follow the crowd, but to those who dare to face the silence of solitude and still speak. When a nation speaks with courage, it is never only about geopolitics, it is also a mirror held up to the individual. If India can face global pressure and refuse to compromise, then you too can confront the chaos of your life without collapsing. That is the deeper meaning of these moments. They are not just history, they are instruction. They remind us that strength is not the property of the powerful alone, but of anyone willing to align with truth. You may feel small compared to the scale of nations, but the principle is the same. The courage of a nation emerges from the courage of its people. The sovereignty of a country reflects the sovereignty of the individual. And sovereignty, for you, means taking responsibility for your life without excuses. It is the willingness to stand when everything tempts you to bow. Every individual is tempted daily to compromise with lies, even small ones. You tell yourself that avoiding conflict is easier, that bending the truth will protect you, that silence will cost you nothing. But every time you do this, you chip away at your own sovereignty. You exchange short-term comfort for long-term weakness. Eventually, the habit of compromise becomes your identity. Nations that live this way collapse, and so do people. The alternative is brutal but necessary, to face reality and accept the burden of truth. India showed us that this path is possible, even when the risks are immense. If a nation can bear that responsibility, why not you? The principle is identical, only the scale differs. Courage at the personal level does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with the smallest acts of honesty. You tell the truth when lying would be easier. You confront a difficult conversation rather than hiding. You take responsibility for your mistakes rather than deflecting blame. Each of these acts is a seed of sovereignty. Over time, they grow into character strong enough to stand in solitude, but the price must be paid up front. There is no shortcut to integrity, just as there is no shortcut to national sovereignty. India's statement reminds us that responsibility cannot be outsourced. Neither can yours. You cannot delegate your character to someone else and still call it your own. The world will always present you with opportunities to compromise. Your workplace will ask for silence when you know you should speak. Your friends will encourage conformity when you know you should resist. Your own mind will whisper excuses about why it's not worth the trouble. But if you bend every time the pressure mounts, you will discover one day that you have nothing left that is truly yours. Sovereignty requires resolve, the ability to say, "This I will not betray." India drew that line in the face of overwhelming pressure. You must draw yours in the face of daily pressures. They may seem small, but their cumulative weight will decide the fate of your soul. There is suffering in this, no doubt. To stand firm means to accept conflict, criticism, perhaps even punishment. It means loneliness at times, as others desert you for easier paths. But suffering for the sake of truth is the price of freedom. The suffering of cowardice is far worse because it corrodes you from within. India chose the suffering of responsibility over the suffering of compromise. That is why its words carried power rather than emptiness. And so it is with you. Choose the suffering that builds strength rather than the suffering that breeds regret. Either way, you will suffer, but one path leads upward, the other downward. Responsibility transforms suffering into meaning. Meaning is what sustains you through chaos. Without meaning, suffering becomes unbearable because it feels pointless. But when suffering is attached to responsibility, it becomes purposeful. That is why individuals who take responsibility live more resiliently. They are not spared hardship, but they are fortified by meaning. Nations, too, thrive when they discover meaning through responsibility. India's words were an act of meaning, not just strategy. They declared that truth was worth the price. And meaning resonates universally because it is what every individual longs for. Without meaning, life collapses into despair. With meaning, even immense challenges become opportunities to demonstrate strength. Resolve does not grow in comfort, it grows in trial. If you wait for ideal circumstances to be courageous, you will never be courageous at all. Courage is born in the moment of decision, when fear is strongest. That is why resolve must be practiced daily, like a muscle. You choose responsibility in small matters so that you are ready for greater ones. Nations that crumble under pressure failed long before their collapse, in the small compromises of their leaders. Individuals who crumble under pressure also fail long before, in their hidden compromises with themselves. India's firmness was not spontaneous. It was built over years of resolve. Your firmness will be no different. It must be cultivated through practice. And when you resolve to carry responsibility, you change not only yourself, but those around you. People notice integrity even when they pretend not to. They see the difference between compromise and courage. They may mock you at first, but secretly they admire it, and sometimes they even imitate it. Courage multiplies one person at a time. That is why India's stand mattered globally. It created the possibility for others to imitate courage. Your stand matters locally because it creates the same possibility. A family is transformed by one person's integrity. A workplace is elevated by one employee's resolve. Courage spreads because it reveals what is possible. The call, then, is not only for nations but for you. If India can face the pressure of the world and remain unmoved, you can face the pressures of your own life. The scale may differ, but the principle does not. Resolve is built in solitude, in the quiet decisions you make when no one is watching. It is tested when pressure comes, when compromise seems easier. But if you refuse to betray yourself, you will stand sovereign in your own life. And that sovereignty will ripple outward, strengthening families, communities, and eventually nations. The courage of one becomes the courage of many. That is the power of resolve.